In a bustling city, where skyscrapers reached for the clouds and people hurried past one another, there was a corporate office building that stood out. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with ambition and competition. Employees rushed to meet deadlines, coffee cups filled the break room, and the constant clicking of keyboards echoed through the halls. Among the sea of suits and ties, one man stood out, Mr. Henderson, the boss. He was known for his sharp tongue, quick temper, and an unwavering belief in his own superiority. But in the shadows of the office, there was someone who rarely crossed paths with Mr. Henderson. Charlie, the janitor. Charlie was a quiet man in his 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes. He had worked in the building for over a decade, cleaning the floors, emptying trash cans, and mopping up spills. He knew the office better than anyone, listening to the conversations and laughter that filled the spaces he maintained. While most employees ignored him, Charlie took pride in his work, believing that even the smallest contributions mattered. One drizzly Tuesday morning, the atmosphere in the office changed. Mr. Henderson had been in a particularly foul mood, and the tension was palpable. Employees whispered behind closed doors, speculating about what might have set him off this time. As Charlie wheeled his cart down the hallway, he overheard snippets of conversations. Rumors of budget cuts, layoffs, and the pressure from higher-ups to produce results. "Can you believe how rude he was to the interns yesterday?" one employee said. "He's like a bulldozer," another replied. "Nothing but a bully." Charlie paused for a moment, feeling the weight of their words. He had seen Mr. Henderson snap at employees before, but he had always managed to stay out of the line of fire. As he continued his cleaning route, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Something told him that today would be different. Later that morning, as Charlie was cleaning the break room, he overheard Mr. Henderson's booming voice from the conference room. "If anyone can't keep up with the demands of this company, they don't belong here," he shouted. The door swung open, and a young intern stumbled out, tears in her eyes. Charlie's heart ached for her. He had seen how hard she worked, how she stayed late to finish projects, often skipping lunch to ensure everything was perfect. Moments later, Mr. Henderson stormed out of the room, his face flushed with anger. "Get out of my way, janitor," he spat, brushing past Charlie without a second glance. It was a familiar routine for him, but today, the words stung more than usual. As the day progressed, the tension only escalated. Employees whispered about the impending layoffs, and Charlie's gut twisted at the thought of someone losing their job. He had seen so many people come and go over the years, but the thought of Mr. Henderson's wrath being directed at someone innocent filled him with dread. Around lunchtime, the office was abuzz with speculation. Charlie quietly cleaned the floors, trying to block out the noise, but the anxiety was palpable. He could feel it in the air, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. As he pushed his cart past the conference room, he overheard a conversation that made his heart race. "Did you hear? Mr. Henderson is planning to fire someone today," one employee whispered. "Who? Do you think it will be one of the interns?" another replied. Charlie's pulse quickened. He had never seen Mr. Henderson so furious. The man had a reputation for being ruthless, and if he was planning to fire someone, it could be devastating. As the afternoon wore on, Charlie's fears became reality. Mr. Henderson called for a meeting in the large conference room. The employees shuffled in, worry etched on their faces. Charlie, standing just outside the door with his cart, caught a glimpse of the tension. "Everyone, I've made some tough decisions," Mr. Henderson announced, his voice booming. "We need to make cuts, and unfortunately, that means letting some people go." Gasps filled the room, and Charlie felt his heart drop. He couldn't bear to see the faces of those who would be affected. "Effective immediately, I'm letting go of one of the interns," Mr. Henderson continued. "You just didn't meet expectations." Charlie's heart sank further as he recognized the intern from earlier. Her face fell, and tears pooled in her eyes. "But I worked so hard," she pleaded. "I can do better." Mr. Henderson's expression hardened. "It's too late for excuses. You're out." The intern turned to leave, her shoulders slumped in defeat. In that moment, Charlie's heart broke for her. He had witnessed Mr. Henderson's cruelty before, but this was something else entirely. Later that day, as Charlie cleaned the floors, he overheard an argument between Mr. Henderson and a senior manager. You can't just fire people without reason, the manager shouted. This is going to ruin morale. They should have done better. Mr. Henderson snapped back. I won't tolerate incompetence in my office. As the day came to a close, the atmosphere felt heavier than ever. Charlie finished his work and packed up his cart, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had always believed in kindness, in understanding, but Mr. Henderson's actions left him feeling hopeless. The next morning, as the sun peeked through the clouds, Charlie arrived at the office with a renewed sense of purpose. He would not let Mr. Henderson's behavior go unchecked. Charlie felt a fire ignite within him, a determination to stand up for those who could not. As he cleaned the offices that day, Charlie began to formulate a plan. He would speak to the employees, gather support, and confront Mr. Henderson. It was time for someone to challenge the toxic culture that had taken root in the office. However, just as Charlie was about to put his plan into action, he overheard another conversation that changed everything. I heard that Mr. Henderson's father is a big shot in the company, one employee whispered. He's been protected because of who his father is. Charlie's heart raced. He had never considered that Mr. Henderson's position might be tied to his family. This was a twist he hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, the thought of confronting him seemed more dangerous than ever. But the more Charlie thought about it, the more he realized that Mr. Henderson's father's influence wouldn't excuse his behavior. The toxic atmosphere had to change, and it was time for someone to speak up. Later that day, after the workday ended, Charlie gathered a small group of employees in the break room. They shared their experiences of Mr. Henderson's outbursts and the fear that permeated the office. It was cathartic, a release of pent-up frustration. Inspired by their stories, Charlie decided to approach Mr. Henderson the following morning. His heart raced as he rehearsed what he would say. He knew it would be risky, but he couldn't allow fear to hold him back any longer. The next day, Charlie arrived early, his heart pounding in his chest. He found Mr. Henderson in his office, reviewing papers. Gathering every ounce of courage, Charlie knocked on the door and stepped inside. Mr. Henderson, he began, his voice steady despite the nerves. We need to talk. The boss looked up, surprise flickering across his face. What do you want, janitor? He asked, his tone dripping with disdain. Charlie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. I wanted to talk about how you treat the employees. Your words have consequences, and people are scared to come to work. It's not right. Mr. Henderson's expression darkened. You think you can tell me how to run my business? You're just a janitor. I may be a janitor, but I see what you don't, Charlie replied, his voice rising. People are working hard, and they deserve to be treated with respect. You're hurting them. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Mr. Henderson's face turned red with anger, but there was something else there, a flash of uncertainty. Get out of my office now, he shouted, but Charlie stood his ground. No, he said firmly. Not until you realize the impact of your actions. You may have power because of your father, but that doesn't give you the right to treat people like this. Mr. Henderson's expression shifted. For a moment, he looked almost vulnerable, as if Charlie's words had struck a nerve. But then the anger returned, and he lunged forward, his face inches from Charlie's. You'll regret this, janitor. You'll be the one who gets fired. Charlie's heart raced, but he refused to back down. Maybe I will, he replied, but at least I'll know I stood up for what's right. With that, Charlie turned and left the office, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. The confrontation had been a gamble, but he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. As days turned into weeks, Charlie noticed a shift in the office. Employees began to speak up, sharing their concerns about Mr. Henderson's treatment. They rallied together, emboldened by Charlie's courage. But Mr. Henderson was not one to back down easily. He retaliated by tightening his grip on the office, becoming even more aggressive. Rumors circulated that he was planning to lay off more employees, and the atmosphere became even more toxic. One afternoon, the tension reached its breaking point. Charlie was cleaning the hallway when he overheard Mr. Henderson shouting at a group of employees. You think you can challenge me? You're all worthless. Charlie felt a surge of anger. This was the moment he had been preparing for. He marched down the hallway, determination coursing through his veins. Mr. Henderson, he called out, his voice steady. You can't treat people like this. It's time for change. Mr. Henderson turned, his eyes blazing. What do you know about running a business? You're just a janitor. Charlie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. I may be a janitor, but I'm also a human being. I care about the people who work here. You're tearing this place apart. In that instant, the room fell silent. Employees watched, their eyes wide with anticipation. Mr. Henderson's anger flared, but there was something else there, a flicker of doubt. You're nothing without your father's influence, Charlie continued, his voice rising. You don't deserve this position if you can't treat people with respect. Mr. Henderson's face twisted with rage, but Charlie pressed on. You can either change your ways or watch this office crumble around you. The choice is yours. With that, Charlie turned and walked away, leaving the room buzzing with tension. Days passed, and Charlie's confrontation lingered in the air. Employees began to share their own stories, standing together against the toxic culture. It was a movement, and Charlie felt a sense of hope that had been missing for so long. But just when it seemed that change was on the horizon, tragedy struck. One morning, as employees filtered into the office, they received the shocking news. Mr. Henderson had collapsed in his office. Panic swept through the building as paramedics rushed to the scene. Charlie watched from a distance, his heart heavy with uncertainty. Despite their differences, he knew the importance of life and the fragility of existence. As the day unfolded, news spread that Mr. Henderson had suffered a heart attack. Employees gathered in hushed groups, their faces a mix of concern and fear. The office that had once felt suffocating now buzzed with a sense of dread. Weeks passed, and Mr. Henderson remained in the hospital. Charlie continued to clean the office, but the atmosphere had shifted. Employees whispered about what would happen next. Would the company change? Would Mr. Henderson return? One afternoon, as Charlie was finishing up his cleaning, he noticed a familiar figure standing in the doorway. It was Mr. Henderson, looking frail and fragile. "Can I talk to you, janitor?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlie's heart raced. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. "Of course," he replied, motioning for Mr. Henderson to sit down. As they talked, Mr. Henderson shared his struggles, the pressure from his father to succeed, the fear of failure that had driven him to become the ruthless boss he had been. "I never wanted to be this way," he admitted, his voice cracking, "but I felt like I had to prove myself." Charlie listened, sensing the vulnerability in Mr. Henderson's voice. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said gently. "You can choose to be better." Mr. Henderson looked down, shame washing over him. "I've hurt so many people," he whispered. "I don't know if I can change." "It starts with acknowledging your mistakes," Charlie replied. "It's never too late to make things right." As their conversation continued, something shifted. Mr. Henderson began to understand the impact of his actions and the importance of treating people with kindness. The wall he had built around himself started to crumble, revealing the man beneath the anger and arrogance. Months later, after Mr. Henderson's recovery, the office transformed. He returned with a renewed perspective and a commitment to change. The atmosphere lightened as he began to foster a culture of respect, where employees felt valued and heard. Charlie watched from the sidelines, feeling a sense of pride in what had been accomplished. He had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, had helped to create a better environment for everyone. As the company thrived, Charlie continued his work as the janitor, knowing that every small effort mattered. He had witnessed the power of change, the importance of compassion, and the strength of unity. In the end, it wasn't just about a rude boss or a janitor standing up for what was right. It was about the journey of understanding and growth, the realization that even the most hardened hearts could learn to change. And as Charlie cleaned the floors of the office he loved, he felt a sense of hope for the future, one that would shine brightly for all who walk through those doors. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch the story of Rude Boss Fires Janitor Collapses when he learns who his father really is. It's a tale of courage, compassion, and change, showing how one person's voice can make a difference in an environment filled with fear and toxicity. If you found this story inspiring, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and how this story impacted you. Also, don't forget to share it with your friends. Let's spread the message of standing up for what's right and fostering kindness in our workplaces and beyond. Stay tuned for more heartwarming stories like this one.